Hi, everybody. I'm Neil from Your Gray Matters. Welcome back. As you know, Your Gray Matters grew out of my belief that the human mind cannot be defeated, that we will always find a way. I call them miracles, solutions, things that already exist, but you may not be aware of them. And today we have on our podcast someone who I've known longer than he and I want to admit. And we grew up in the same city. We have a lot of things that I think that you will find interesting, that we have in common. And I'm really excited to have him on. And as I always say, whether you have gray hair or no hair or red hair, but come on, we know what's under that. You can see absolutely that Avrum qualifies on his head, on his face, no question about it. Avrum, welcome. We are so thrilled to have you on Your Gray Matters.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, I'm very, very lucky. You know, there's a great rabbi, Noah Weinberg, and he once said that people often avoid making decisions out of the fear of making a mistake. But actually, failure to make those decisions is one of life's big mistakes. And I was excited, I'm still excited to have you on because you've made a lot of decisions over the years. And those decisions have absolutely changed people's lives. And you probably don't know, but I'm going to tell you anyways in front of all these listeners and viewers. You save lives, you create lives, and you've done amazing things for a guy who's just in his early 60s. I can't imagine what you're going to do for the next 60 years. And thank you. Hey, everybody, I've known Avrum, like I said, since he was a kid. We both come from Kitchener, Ontario. His late parents, Rabbi Rosensweig and Guido Rosensweig, played major roles in my life as I was growing up, and unknown numbers of people's lives. And Avrum is the youngest of 5 kids. We're going to get into this because I'm the eldest of 5 kids, but he had to deal with 4 sisters. So I think that in itself might be an interesting podcast. And let me tell you, he's so amazing because you're going to hear what he creates. He is a creator. Everything from humorous TV and radio to important artwork to saving people's lives to charities. Amazing guy. Avrum, welcome to Your Gray Matters. We are just simply really excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. It's great to be here. I'm happy to be here too.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. And I've been watching your new, I don't know if I should call your new podcast or your rejuvenated podcast, Marty and Avrum, the food guys. But I got to tell you, folks, it's great. And it's on YouTube. And you should really check into this. A little bit about our friend Avrum here. He went to rabbinical school. He and I both ended up in Jewish community work, taking care of the community. And then Avrum left that and launched his own humanitarian organization called Via Havta. And we're going to talk a lot about that today because this touches everybody's lives. He is a great proponent of what we call Tikkun Olam, which is repairing the world. That's a big part of his life, and I'd like to thank mine. And Avrum, you also did all that great stuff. Then you ended up on commercial radio and television, and your show touched a lot of people, and to this day has a cult following, because I know I'm a member of the cult. So I don't often say that, by the way. And there's just so much to talk about. But ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you some of the people that Avrum has interviewed on his shows, because it's amazing what he's done. And then we'll go in and talk directly to Avrum. But I got to brag about Avrum a little bit. He had on his shows David Shore, the co-creator of House, The Good Doctor. He had Steve Paikin on, the great Canadian interviewer from TVO. Pat Rush, who was a guitarist with Johnny Winters, one of my favorite bands, no question about it. And he had on Jeff Healey. He had his own son's bar mitzvah teacher on, and he had and he had a man Joseph Pasuma, he was a Roma man who for 3 years, so as not to be deported to Hungary, he was involved, Avrum, in helping him. And it's a great story. Ladies and gentlemen, Avrum Rosensweig. Avrum, you grew up as a rabbi's son. Tell us, what was that like?
Well, like most things in life, it has its yin and yang. I would say that the yin of growing up a rabbinical son is that we grew up in a magical home, Neil. My parents were activists, and part of that activism was introducing my sisters and I to the outside world, bringing the outside world into our home.
Right.
So we had people living with us for a week, for a month, for a year, 2 years, individuals who other might call very difficult.
Yes.
But my parents were of the ilk. They came from that time where they were really righteous Jews. They were ones who reached out to others who were in need. It's like in the Torah that we're learning right now, Abraham and Sarah, they stood by the openings of their tents, all four sides, where they could see strangers coming and they could take care of them. That's who my parents were. So the yin of that was, it was truly a magical upbringing from a ritualistic point of view, spiritual point of view, and an activist point of view. The challenge of being a rabbi's son, rabbi's child, is that there's a lot of expectations on you, oh, you're the rabbi's son, right? You're not supposed to be talking now. That was difficult. And also being the only religious Jews in Kitchener at that time was also very daunting. I was a little guy, and I got to school wearing my kippah because that's what my father wanted. And I would I'd literally in kindergarten have these kids running after me and hurling these awful anti-Semitic epithets at me. It was to be, I think, seen as the rabbi's son, and in fact, to be the rabbi's son, there was a pressure on me from an early age, and I had a hard time with that.
I can imagine, or maybe I can't, but I know that there had to be expectations on you. And I must tell you that someone who was living in the community and got great joy from your family, I'm quite a bit older than you, so I didn't really know you that well, but I was in the same Hebrew school class as your eldest sister. I remember being someone who absolutely made me feel welcome always, as did your parents. But I couldn't wait until the end of the Sabbath on Saturday night, every Saturday night. I would know that until Sabbath was over, of course, I couldn't call her. But at the crack of the new week, I would call Etty and we would have to discuss that night's Toronto Maple Leaf game. And we had a bet. I just spoke to Etty recently. She doesn't remember this, but I do. 25 cents. And I reminded her, I think she owes me 25 cents for about 60 years now. So I plan to go and visit her someday and collect. But
yeah, you might get it in shekels, but
I'd be happy to get
yeah, right, exactly.
deliver them first. I'll go pick
Right.
them up personally.
Right.
Avram, but that little story actually was really, really important to me because it was something that I very much looked forward to every week. And it was interesting in those days to know that I could go and talk to your dad or your mom if I needed to. They were available. I'm quite sure now, being much older, I now know they weren't always available, of course, but I never found that as a kid. And I think that that was also a great way that it described our synagogue growing up. I found it to be a place to go to, and it was an important place. But you had four sisters, and you grew up as the youngest. And so that's an interesting role, too, I would imagine, because being the only boy, you would be seen to do certain things in those days, but you also had to compete for time with four other kids in the house. And from what you're telling me, usually a lot of visitors in your home, I would imagine, too.
Yeah.
So we both grew up, it's interesting, and ended up doing the same kind of work for a while. You ended up working for Toronto UJA in the 90s. And I ended up doing it, actually working for United Jewish Appeal throughout the 80s and into the middle 90s professionally. And I just found it interesting that we both did that. I think one time I even found your desk where you were sitting was where I had been sitting when I had worked there before. I don't know what that means, but we did that. And I found that kind of work important, and I found it gratifying. But then you took a step. You did something that I think is miraculous and is touching lives to this day. And this is a big part of what I want to discuss. You created an organization, a charity called Vayahafta. That change that you made, as I started to learn about it years ago and started to figure out in my mind how many lives you've touched because of that. So let's talk about Vayahafta. Please tell us anything that you want, Avrum, including what does it mean for those who are watching us, and tell us the work you did and why you did it, please.
Right. So thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it. V'ahavta means and you should love. And it comes from the Torah. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, right? You should love your brother and sister as you love yourself. We find it in the Shema. It's very poignant. It's a very important word and phrase. The idea that within Judaism, at the core of it is that we need to love ourselves and subsequently to love others. That's a big task, but what other task is there in life, to create love and to create unity because of that? So I decided around 1994, when I was working at the United Jewish Appeal and being witness to what was going on in Rwanda at that time, which was a genocide, as well as watching the war in the Balkans, I found it difficult that we, the Jewish people, were saying never again a lot. In other words, that when an injustice should happen in the world, that we would respond, but yet we didn't have a Jewish humanitarian organization in Canada. There were many Christian humanitarian organizations, Muslim humanitarian organizations. And I was thinking over that period of time, well, maybe we can start one. So it took me about 2 years to get the mission statement down, which was to encourage all Jews to play a role in Tikkun Olam, as you said before. And we launched our programs in 1997, and they were fascinating, Neil. It was incredible what we accomplished then and what V'ahavta is accomplishing now. But the idea was to have Jews roll up their sleeves. And like the Maimonides said, that if you want to help your brother, then you have to be prepared to get your hands or your fingernails dirty. And that was the idea behind V'ahavta. Let's get people out there. Jewish volunteerism in the name of and in the context of Tikkun Olam. And then, like I said, we set about creating these wonderful programs, both locally and internationally, and people started coming out. It was really something, and it is really something.
And let's get into some of those programs, Avrum, because and please talk on all the programs that you would like to, but you have played a major role, and Vayahafta has in helping the homeless. And that actually got me so interested and probably brought us to this podcast today, because talk about what you've done for the homeless, because I find it miraculous and more than generous and just godly in what you did.
So the idea behind the V'ahavta programming was to be as creative as possible and to really administer programs that would elicit the creativity within our clients. Mm-hmm. So you're correct. We work locally. We also had an international arm at that time for the first 10 years of V'ahavta. But I think that the homeless department really is the spine and was the spine of V'ahavta. It was the idea that we would get people out into the streets on our V'ahavta van to work with, to listen to give out food and drink to those people who are living on the street, whom we call homeless. And we created programming around that as well. As an example, we had a creative writing contest for the homeless for many years.
Wow.
many years, and people would write creative pieces. Top prize was $2,000. Sorry.
Wow.
We had judges like Mia Farrow, Michael Andance. We had the former Prime Minister of the UK, Tony Blair. These are all people who we were in touch with in one way or the other, and we asked them to be judges for our creative writing contest.
Wow.
We had art shows for the homeless. We started up a number of different educational programs, and including homework clubs. And the list goes on and on. It was really, really something. You know, the first 5 or 6 or 7 years of any entity is really like the honeymoon period. And I just felt as though everything was gold, nothing could go wrong, and we were on fire. You know, then the administrative stuff starts to kick in. But I would say that the V'ahavta today, which is run by Carrie Kozarek, I've retired as the CEO or the executive director, is also magnificent. It's magnificent what she's created and what her staff has created. So yeah, it's good.
Well, congratulations, Mazel Tov. We will, of course, be posting the website so that people can go to it and look at it. And if they would like to certainly give some money to donate to these great causes. I want to ask you, though, Tony Blair and these other great people who you connected with, you have an ability to connect with people, Avrum, and I know it's more than just your good looks. I'm just wondering how the heck you do that. How does a person step out and get the attention of people to whom they want to have a connection to?
Well, listen, you did it a few weeks ago. You had Howard was your guest.
Harvey Brownstone, yeah.
Internationally renowned for his podcasting interviews, and a magnificent at it. And he himself has exposure to some of the greats, some of the children of greats. And we're talking about superstars in Hollywood. Yep. So you've done it. Listen, there are different types of people in life, and there's a whole group of them, which is called networkers. And networkers are essentially people who have the guts to go up to strangers and say to them, "Hi, how you doing? My name's Neil, or my name's Avrum. You know, I have a podcast. I wonder if you can help me out." And I've done that. And a lot of times these greats will respond with, "Sure. Yeah, like I remember where I came from. And yeah, if I can help, sure." So it really just takes a lot of guts, a lot of vision. Like, in other words, you have to know who you're going for, and really have the wherewithal to follow it through. And you'll find that a lot of times these really great people in the world will say yes. They will.
And that has been my experience. But I'm glad that you're sharing this, because I want all people to know that you have greatness. And every single person has a story to tell. And somebody else is going to not only want to hear it, they need to hear your story. Not in a complaining way, but I've often learned that once you overcome something, you tell your story, you're no longer complaining. You're actually being able to say how you overcame. And it's funny what you said, because I got started because I heard a speaker many years ago named Randy Taylor, who has a morning radio show now and is recognized as one of Canada's top motivational speakers. And at a real estate gig, I was the guy on stage introducing. I introduced him, never met him before. By the next week, I was having lunch with him. He heard my story. And 2 weeks later, I was on stage doing my first motivational speech. And he's been on this podcast. And you're right. I think, though, I'm a very shy guy by nature and had to build the confidence, thankfully, through guys like Randy Taylor, to know that my story is important. And ladies and gentlemen, your stories are important too. A big part of why we do this podcast. My friend, you have done so many things. V'ahavta, we've touched on. Everybody should look into this great organization. But you're also an artist and a writer. Did you know that you had these skills your whole life? Was it something that you wanted, or where does all this come from?
Right. So that's a very good question, Neil. You know, when we look back at our childhood, and we kind of superimpose what's happening today over that time, for me, sometimes I can actually see that, yeah, there was artistry inside of me from a very early age. I remember in kindergarten, Miss Bainan, I believe it was, Miss Bainan at Shepherd Public School, Which school did you go to in kindergarten?
Harold Wagner on Bridgeport Road.
Okay, so you went to it. We probably played you in soccer or something, you know.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Anyway, so she said to me, she said to the class, Avrum made this wonderful picture. It, for some reason, it was of a British Bobby. You know how we remember those things from the time when we were kids? It
Yes.
was British Bobby, and she gave me accolades for it. And then that was that, you know, as a 5-year-old, I didn't think much of it. And then later on, many, many years later, I started painting, and that kind of clicked. You know, I thought, yeah, I guess I had it from early on. Nature versus nurture. Was I born with it? I don't know. But I began to paint and I began to write as well. Writing came first. And as I did, I found that I was highly passionate about it. And I really enjoyed it. I had a regular weekly column in the Canadian Jewish News for about 20 years.
Wow.
And yeah, it was really something. It's hard to write on a weekly basis. I don't know how people do it on a daily basis,
That's for sure.
right? It's a challenge. As far as painting goes, it was really on my own schedule until I decided to actually create an art show at the end of October, which was unfortunately subsequently canceled because of the war in Israel. But these things kind of came together, and I stayed with them. Really, really, staying in the game is key with anything. And
Yeah.
I started to realize, you know, I called myself a writer, but it took me many, many years, Neil, many years to call myself an artist.
Well, I have to say, I've seen some of your work and it is glorious
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
and important. It's really, really beautiful. Um, you do something so cool every year. I haven't attended yet, but I've decided I'm attending next year. You have synagogue services at the high holidays outside. And when we met a few weeks ago to start talking about this, you talked about vibration. We're all vibration. That's what we are. And we could have a podcast just on that. But tell us about why you lead services outside and tell people so that they'll know when to come and where to come.
I am incredibly devoted to my Jewishness and to my people, the Jewish people. That being said, I'm not very traditional.
Yeah, that's what I like about you.
Right. My family's all very traditional. They grew up Orthodox, going to services, keeping kosher, doing most of the mitzvot that one is required to do. I gave that up around 20 years old.
Yeah.
And while I was extraordinarily passionate about my Judaism, as I am today, I needed to find a way that worked for me.
Uh-huh.
One of the ways that worked for me within Judaism was through Tikkun Olam. The Haftarah was a manifestation, really, of my own desire to create a Jewish world for myself that made sense,
Yeah.
and subsequently for others. I, you know, wondered about 5 or 6 years ago. You ever heard the word shpilkus?
Yeah, for sure. I live on them.
Right. So I live on shpilkus too. Shpilkus is like, I can't stop moving. You know, I'm impatient, right? I got to move.
It's Yiddish for ADD, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Right. ADD, you know. And the idea of sitting in Shul on Rosh Hashanah for 4 or 5 hours, the idea of sitting in Shul in Yom Kippur for the entire day almost, is anathema, really, honestly, to who I am.
Yes.
So I wanted to do something on the high holidays. I think many Jews have that sense. While they may not want to go to a traditional shul, they feel as though they need to do something. Kol Nidre, the night of Yom Kippur, ominous liturgy. It's probably the most ominous of all the Jewish liturgy. You want to be there, right?
Yeah.
But honestly, I couldn't sit through it. So I decided to start my own thing, and I call it the Forest Shul. And essentially what I started doing was taking a group of people, around 25, 30 people, into Earl Bale's forest, which is at Shepherd and Bathurst. It's beautiful. We are blessed to have it. And, you know, the city is so lush, and I have this incredible forest right next to me. So I would take people into the forest, and we would do an abridged service, which would include traditional prayer,
Mm-hmm.
the blowing of the shofar when appropriate, but a lot of introspection and a lot of talking. And at some point during the service, I would have everybody get up, and each person would have to find their own tree.
Uh-huh.
And you know, some people call it tree hugging. I don't want to detract from our experience at all, but you know, by drawing upon a phrase which is often mocked, I would just say to people, go and connect with nature. sense and feel God if that's your wherewithal. Think about the millions of people who have come before us. So many have walked through this forest in other generations. Feel that vibration of our past, of our present, and of our future, and become part with it. And people would do that. And I told them an experience from my sister Javi after she lost her husband, who was murdered. She had a hard time crying. And someone said to her, well, let me ask you this. I'm sorry, she had a hard time praying. And someone said to her, do you cry? And she said, oh, yeah, I cry. She said, well, tears are a form of prayer. And I told this to people. I said, there are many different ways of praying. One way is by being here with us together in nature, by going over it, by touching that tree, a creation of God, and feeling its vibration.
Wow. This is incredibly special and moving, because as I've told you off camera, my bride Linda and I have spent a lot of years now studying our own alignment with nature and with vibration and souls, and that's a whole other discussion. But what you just said is beautiful. There's one thing though, I do have to make a comment. When you do it with the trees and the tree hugging, do I have to get like a skull cap from Tilly's, or I can wear any skull?
Tilly's. I like Tilly's because you can always replace it if you lose it. Right?
Exactly. It's like the
Uh,
10-gallon yarmulke.
yeah, listen, I have people coming there with kippot, without kippot,
Sure.
women with talisim, the shawls without. I'm pretty liberal about this whole thing. I have one end game, and that end game is for people to leave that service and have a sense that they experience something spiritual in their own way, and that they're closer to the Jewish people and God.
Yes, and clearly you must be doing it. And next year, I think I'm going to make a radical change. My bride wasn't able to go to Shul for a lot of years due to a car accident, so we got used to taking advantage of the internet and spending the Jewish holidays on the internet in specific synagogues, and that's been very joyful too. And we've seen different kinds of services because, as you know, we come in many flavors, we Jewish people, in our approach to how to pray to God. So I got to ask you, Marty, I got to ask you, Avrum. Marty's the other guy. Avrum, you ended up being an entertainer. You broadcast on Toronto AM 1010 and Toronto AM 640. You had a TV, and it was centered around food. And yet I'm watching your latest version that's come back, and congratulations, because I can't wait for each episode. But you're really not talking about food so much as you're talking about people's spirit and people's experience. Tell us about your show, and I think everybody should watch and listen.
Right. So years ago, my friend Marty and I started up a radio show, and we were fortunate enough to get a gig very quickly on Talk 640. At that time, it was a 1 hour show. It eventually evolved to 2 hours. There were some shows we had which were 3 hours long, and it was all about food. It's called Marty and Avrum, the Food Guys. We were on for 10 years. You're right. We were on Talk 640. We were on CFRB, CHFI, and some other stations. I was delighted about it because it was so much different than the other things I was doing. When you're involved in Tikkun Olam and humanitarian work, it's draining.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
So Marty and I started doing at the same time this show, and it was hokey, really, really hokey and quirky.
Yeah.
Really offbeat. And I knew very little about food other than Eastern European cholent and kishka and knishes, and that was my fare, So, but I was honest about it, and so was Marty. Marty claims he knows about food. He doesn't know a lot. But we had a great time, and we used to interview servers, sommeliers, restaurateurs, stars. We had some really interesting stars on, like Harry Belafonte, Michael Bublé. It was great. Anyways, we stopped in 2006, and we took about a 20-year hiatus. And then at some point in time, we were talking. We said, let's start it up again. And we want to diversify a little bit. So we started talking more about the human experience, behavior, and bringing on guests who could talk more so about happiness and so on. I think we're probably going to move a little bit back towards food because we both find it fascinating. But for now, well, we'll see where it goes.
Well, I'll tell you, it's food for thought and it's food for the heart. And I've been I've been loving your new show, and I look forward to it. And thank you and congratulations for doing it. Actually, it's important. Marty Gallen, I gotta just ask you for a few minutes about Marty. He's flamboyant. You tell a really funny story just in a recent episode of how you came in one day to do the show, and Marty said, "We have a guy in watches coming on the show," and it turned out to be like the CEO of Timex.
Yeah,
And I
right.
found that to be hysterical. But I think, and Marty's not here to defend himself right now. I hope to have him on, but he really is a great mind, isn't he? He's really something special.
Yeah. Marty's really highly unique. I met him at Julius Sis's Passover Seder.
Ah,
You know Julius?
I remember Julius. Yes.
Yeah. So Julius is Jews for Judaism,
Yep.
and he's a very flamboyant character as well. He and Marty have been friends forever, and Marty and I we clicked right away. There's no other person in the world that I've ever met like Marty Gallen.
Yeah. I watch him and I'm thinking the same thing for me.
Yeah, he's never taken a note.
Yeah.
He has no files, right? When we used to put together the show, I was sort of the producer side, and he was like the networker side, like we talked about before.
Right.
He could network with anybody, He wasn't afraid to ask anybody. And then when our show lineup, we'd sit down and talk about it. Let's say the show was on Sunday, we talk about it on Tuesday or Wednesday. He would say, "Oh yeah, Avrum, we're having like I said, Harry Belafonte's on, or some of these great stars, right?" And I said, "Oh, Mart, how did you get them?" He goes, "Well, I was at an event because he goes out to events all the time, and I met his agent, and I asked his agent, and then he follows up and follows up and follows up and follows up. He doesn't let go, and we created a really cool show. So Marty really was I think he was the strength behind getting wonderful guests, and I was the guy who was able to put it all together. So we make for a really good team, but he is unique.
Yeah, he is. And you guys are great because I love watching you sometimes because it's almost like I know I'm having fun, but I'm not quite sure knowing what's going to happen next. And it reminds me a lot of my life lately with different things. So
Right.
I wanted to ask you though, you did Hat Radio also, and that was very successful. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about Hat Radio, because I'm sure that a lot of people watching today certainly know about Hat Radio.
So I decided, like 600,000 other people at that time, I guess it was a couple of years ago now, 2, 3 years ago, to start up a podcast.
Yeah.
And I did that because I always felt as though when I was doing commercial radio, my interviews were 3, 4 minutes long, right? But I'm the type of person who really likes to probe. I really like to understand who a person is.
Yes.
And excuse me. So I decided that I was going to launch a podcast, and I was going to do long form interviews. So I've done interviews that are 45 minutes, an hour and a half, 2 hours, some 2.5 hours. Maybe I've even got 3.
Wow.
I know. And people always say, "Well, that's an awful lot of them. We can only hear something for 30 minutes." And so I go, "Well, then don't listen, or come back to it for 2 or 3 days. Like you can listen to it at your leisure." And I ended up interviewing regular folk, Neil, regular folk, because I am fascinated by individuals and their stories, like you were saying before. What motivates humankind? I like nothing more, honestly, and I've done this interview, to talk to a server at Wimpy's, my friend Dodie.
Yes, and I'm taken by that, and I love that. Was that the person who we met when we went to that restaurant last week?
Yeah.
I kind of thought so, yeah.
She's a kind, generous of spirit, lovely human being. She takes care of her customers as she would people in her home.
Yes.
She's the person who they call upon whenever there's problems with a client in the restaurant. Why? Because she is sweet and good by nature. She's one of those people, Neil, that we're all looking for to meet to mentor, to be mentored by, to share our time with. Dodi's a special person. And she would be what we qualify, let's say, relative to Taylor Swift.
Yes.
She lives a normal, regular life,
Yeah.
right? But don't most of us,
Yes, exactly.
right? So what are we thinking about, right? What motivates us during the course of the day? What are our experiences with love? What's our experience with being dropped by a partner? What are the traditions within our food, within our culture? Just our neighbors are fascinating, Neil, and I want to talk to them and I want to know all of them.
You know
That's
what?
my podcast.
And I enjoyed the banter when I was with you with her. I had a suspicion that that was her, but ladies and gentlemen, I suggested a restaurant that Avrum and I go to, not knowing if Avrum had ever been there in my naivety. We walked into this restaurant. He was greeted, "Hello, Avrum, and do you want your regular table?" And sure. And back we went, and I thought, isn't this cool? I eat where he does. That's cool. But she's a great person. You're doing life coaching now. And I invite you to talk about that because it's fascinating. Not so much that you're doing this. I can see why people would want to do it with you, but why are you doing it in your mind and why do you love it?
Right. So these are very challenging questions you ask.
I hope not, but go ahead. I practiced all night.
You did a good job. Um, Listen, I think one of the biggest challenges that we all have, or most of us have, is taking ourselves seriously. Who am I? Right. And since I started coaching, which was 2 or 3 years ago, I've had to ask myself, like, where do I get off coaching? What do I have to offer? And I am not being self-deprecating, although it sounds that way.
Yes.
I'm really taking a hard look at what I have to offer,
Mm-hmm.
what I have to offer people who I coach. And here's where I arrived at in an answer to that question. I have one son, one child, and I love him dearly. And I have really worked hard over his 17 years until 120, which would make me 160.
Go for it.
Yeah, right. That I want to listen to him really carefully. I want to hear what he has to say. And I want to be able to backtrack if I'm making a mistake and at the same time apologize.
Yes.
I want it to be as real and down to earth and organic as possible, our relationship, right? So that he could feel positively about it himself, that he could get a sense that someone's got his back, as his mother does, and that he would grow through that encouragement that I could hopefully give him. And I thought I would kind of take the philosophy of parenting into my world of coaching. Obviously, when appropriate, you tailor it according to your client.
Correct.
But I wanted to do the same thing with my clients. And that would be, Neil, to listen really closely, to give a lot of compliments on what they've achieved, because we don't compliment enough in our culture, right?
Yes.
And maybe to give some creative ideas that could help people discover purpose and meaning in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of my coaching in a nutshell.
It's so extremely important. And I don't think that it's self-deprecating and wondering about our own journeys and what we can offer to others. In fact, it takes a very wide thinking person, a very generous person to, when asked or not asked, to try to help someone, to give our time to them. I can tell you, and people who watch this show ever know that I'm very, very big in mentoring. I actually did not get a chance to have post-secondary education, except for a few months at a school. But I didn't know at the time that you have to have money to go to school, so that didn't work out. But we entered a business, Linda and I, back in the 90s. And the first thing I knew, I had mentors. And those mentors were people who had accomplished what I wanted, but more importantly, were prepared to help me to get to my own dreams. And I learned about reading, and I learned about sharing, and I learned most importantly about joy and the importance of joy. And I was really excited when I saw that you were doing coaching. I was excited from afar because innately you understand how to help people. And more importantly, you take it very seriously. You're concerned for others. That, I think, would be the title of this podcast. Avrum, the man who has great concern for others, but has taken the time to have a life himself. And thank God. Avram, I hope that people will be in touch with you and via Hafta and your life coaching. If you want to give us a website to go to, we're going to post all this for you. I want to thank you so much for coming on. This is very interesting. And I will finish with this, which is the podcast grew out of my belief, as I said, that the human mind cannot be defeated. I was just telling one of my old mentors that idea popped into my head in 1996. I heard it from a great speaker named Paul Zane Pilzer. Little did I know that would become the basis of the way that I lived my life from that point, believing in people. And as we started to create the podcast 6 months ago, I think maybe the first, maybe the second name I wrote down was yours. And I wanted to have you on because you create miracles, solutions for people that people don't necessarily know exist. That is the podcast. So with that, I'm going to thank you for coming on, tell you that I'm honored, and I look forward to hanging out at the restaurant and going to see Dodie again, and just continued blessings in all of your endeavors. Keep going, because Avram, you make people's lives better.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. Appreciate that very much.
And ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching today. We'll be back next week, and keep going with your own dreams and goals, folks. Have a great week.